Get in, loser. We're going to Carthage. I have basically two sides to my personality. Inside of me, there are two wolves. I'm a simple man. One half of me is forever quoting lines from the movie Roadhouse with Patrick Swayze, and the other half of me is forever quoting lines from the movie Mean Girls. And that's what that line was from. Get in, loser, we're going shopping is a quote from the movie Mean Girls. I have to explain that now, I understand, because apparently millennials aren't cool anymore. I'm devastated to learn this. I read it in The Guardian, so I know it must be true. And if millennials were still cool and we were still the young hip new kids on the block, nobody would need me to explain where the line "get in, loser, we're going to X" comes from, because everybody my age, if you were raised at a certain period of time, you saw this movie and you probably quote it as much as I do. It's just got a weird, earwormy sort of quality. Tina Fey at the top of her game. It's got line after line that people remember. She doesn't even go here, or I just have a lot of feelings. I mean, these are like forever running around, living rent-free in people's head. The same is true, by the way, of Roadhouse, which is a slightly earlier movie, 1989, classic bad good movie. Kung fu, action, Patrick Swayze, and just a script that's better than it has any right to be. It's got lines in it like "pain don't hurt" and "be nice until it's time to not be nice." There's just so many good lines in that movie, and between the two of them, they basically answer every possible situation there is. But for this situation, for this episode of Young Heretics, Mean Girls just seemed appropriate because this is going to be kind of a catty episode. We have reached one of the great showpieces, set pieces of Virgil's epic, the Aeneid. If you've been following along, we closed out book 3 last time, and now we are on to the famous, the beloved, the tragic, the heartbreaking book 4. This is where the love affair that has been simmering, brewing, the romantic and sexual tension between Aeneas from Troy, who has fled the fallen city of Troy to Carthage, and Dido, the queen of Carthage, they're going to burst out into this disastrous fling and this disastrous affair. And I've been teasing all along that the big situation or question here that people have debated ever since Virgil composed this epic is, who's in the wrong here, if anybody? Is it the gods? Are these two? Is this man and this woman, these mortal couple? Are they just victims of fate? Is it Aeneas for heartlessly, cruelly pressing onward in pursuit of his destiny when he had led Dido on and promised her, or seemed to promise her, a love that would last through the ages and a union that would define the epochs? Is it Dido because she let her passions get the best of her and she was just a sort of crazy lady gone wild, who was so driven mad by lust and passion that she had inordinate desires and she made impossible demands on Aeneas and he had to sort of slowly back away? Is it some combination, some tragic alignment of the stars that conspires to make this terrible thing happen? And who should we sympathize with? And spoiler alert, my assessment here is going to be that there is no simple answer to that question because Virgil's a better poet, a better artist than that. Everybody here is in some way flawed. Even the gods are flawed. But the thing that happens is the only thing that can happen, the thing that must happen. And the central fact of the poem is the destiny of Rome. That's what takes first place above everything else, and that's why this is the poem of the Augustan age, because it is a reaffirmation of duty to Rome above all else, above passion, above love, above personal desires. Individuality is all secondary to the grand project of founding the Roman world, as it will eventually become. And so this is the thing that has to happen. Everybody involved is flawed and broken. Everybody makes mistakes. But what's going on here is that each individual person is clashing up against that destiny in a distinctive way. And the men do it in a kind of male sort of way, and the women do it in a sort of female sort of way. And there's all kinds of human foibles on display here. And there's also a really careful portrait. If you read it closely, there's a really careful portrait of a sort of nuclear meltdown of relations between the sexes. So that makes it a particularly poignant book to read right now, I think, because we've been living through this famous war between the sexes, and it's been escalating for as long as I've been alive. When I was a kid, we were kind of still in the late tail of the second wave of feminism, which was all about like girl bossery and Sex in the City. And so then it was thought that, people who were angry about this thought it was feminazis who had taken control and they're totally emasculating men. Then there was sort of this backlash movement that said, no, men should be in charge of everything again. We kind of saw the rise of the manosphere and this almost caricatured reassertion of masculinity that was over and above anything that traditional masculinity actually meant, because now we were on the offensive and we were sort of in this death spiral of everybody escalating their war between the sexes. And now we seem to have this kind of thaw or confusion. It's like a little bit of a reeling after the fight. Like the cities are all bombed out and everybody is wounded and nobody quite knows what to do, how to reapproach a healthy relationship between men and women. And that kind of situation, I think, is also on display here. Virgil is showing how the unique glories of manhood and womanhood can also become these unique failings and flaws. And when things get out of whack, when things get off kilter, everything kind of cascades into a disastrous spiral. So there's that very human drama going on, and it is being aggravated or driven forward by this larger divine story of the foundation of Rome. And so just to set up the relevance here, I wanted to read a tweet, or I guess an X post that I saw recently that kind of made the rounds. It's from Lizzie Stardust. And here's, again, why I'm an uncool millennial, because I'm still on X while everybody else is on TikTok. But Lizzie Stardust, with, I believe, 3 R's, tweets out, "I submit that young women were not meant to understand male sexuality, as, if they did, a great many would be so disgusted by its realities they would cease engaging in sex with men. Coming to terms with the realities of male sexuality is part of the female sexual maturation process." Well, this is an interesting observation, and I think that the point that most people made that I agree with is that this kind of goes both ways, that both men and women grow up with a sort of romantic aura around the opposite sex. And part of that is good. It's part of the mystique, but it also can create all of these confusions and foibles and these eternal kind of farcical problems. The way of a man with a maid, right? This is like a forever thing. But I do think that the word disgust here is suggestive of this breakdown that we've lived through, of people losing the ability to understand one another and starting to look at each other not with a kind of bemused delight, but with this awestruck horror. How can men be such animals? How can women be such crazy, irrational psychopaths? I mean, just we go on and on, this sort of roundabout of mutually escalating disgust. And it has to do with the caricature or the breakdown of each sex's relative kind of strengths and weaknesses and tendencies. And I think that this is kind of the next thing that Lizzie says. She says, "In modernity, where our sex and relationship structures of polite mirage have largely crumbled, laying bare harsher realities, young women must square these more basal systems of male sexuality with normal but different human functioning." In other words, she's saying we used to have a system of decorum for easing people into the jagged and the difficult and the scary parts of men and women getting together. Now everything is out in the open. It's kind of laid bare, and that makes it particularly brutal and upsetting for people and jarring when there aren't any more rules about what you can and can't do. You just have these kind of raw forces. And it's funny because that is a very modern problem. That's also kind of exactly what happens to Aeneas and Dido. And it happens on purpose. It's engineered in many ways by Venus, who is the best goddess in some ways in the poem. She's the ancestor of Augustus. She's definitely meant to be given honor here, but she also has a history of scheming and tea spilling, and she is kind of a mean girl. And that's another thing that Virgil is dealing with here, is he's kind of showing this very catty and underhanded subterfuge that Venus does, while also putting it in the service of Rome. Because in order for Aeneas to move on to Rome, this love affair has to break down. It has to be destroyed. And so Dido has to basically go crazy, and Aeneas has to basically lose her, because otherwise Juno, the rival goddess, will get her way, and Aeneas will stay in Carthage forever because it's so welcoming and nice, and he doesn't really want to go back out again and go to all the hassle of sort of embarking on yet another journey. And so in the modern age, sometimes we say, well, it was the feminists who engineered this crisis of the sexes, or maybe it was the postmodernists, or it was, and there's a lot of truth to this. But in Virgil's story, it's kind of this God-ordained, it's like there are forces beyond Dido's and Aeneas' control that are cracking open this raw sexuality. And one of those forces is the goddess of love herself, who, remember, has infected Dido. And you can go back to our episodes on book 1, where I talk about love as this kind of all-powerful, all-consuming, and also destructive force of flame and arrow shafts. And Eros, who is Cupid, or the baby son, the young son of Venus, has been sent down in the guise of Ascanius. And now, in Virgil's telling, because he needs to elevate Venus, Cupid is basically totally obedient. He's a pious, obedient son to his mother, and not the chaos agent, the mystical, mischievous, all-powerful, like, toddler holding his mother hostage that he is in some of the earlier Greek literature. But he goes down as he's commanded by Venus to infect Dido. He pretends to be Ascanius, who is Aeneas' son, and now Dido is totally just gaga over Aeneas. And the first speech I'm going to read you here, this is a book 4 is full of banger speeches. And so we are going to read a lot of speeches together. It's some of the most dramatic, and it's almost designed to read like a stage tragedy. This is where Dido kind of becomes one of the great heroines of tragedy, as we'll get into discussing. But this first speech I'm going to read here is kind of this portrait of female sexuality in some of its worst forms. So obviously, the kind of beautiful ideal here of female sexuality is that it is coy and coquettish, but also alluring. And when we first saw Dido, she was also strong. She had this reserve. She was compared to Diana, the virgin goddess of the hunt. And she had this regal power, and she was definitely kind of along the lines of maybe a Cleopatra, who was a major figure from Virgil's day. And she has this sort of bearing and carriage that is queenly. And that's, I think, the ideal of Virgil, for Virgil, of female sexuality. It's also an ideal that we, I think, can still share, this queenly self-control that is aligned also with a softness and a nurturing power. Now that this has become infected and diseased, it starts to break down. And the way that it breaks down is the coquettishness, the sort of coy suggestiveness, gets turned around to undermine the queenly restraint. So the queenly restraint starts to become a facade, and she starts to let slip, as if by accident, that she really, really, really wants to sleep with this guy. And it turns out that she's made a vow never to get married because she's a widow. Her husband, Sychaeus, is dead. We've heard that story already. And she's now going to give just an absolutely, I'm not saying, I'm just saying kind of speech to her sister, Anna, who is one of my favorite minor characters in the poem. They have this very close and quite beautiful sisterly bond, which also is going to get destroyed and lead to tragedy and disaster here. But the first thing that she says is Anna soror, oh sister Anna. And so, as always, I'm reading you my translation here of this speech which she gives, where she's just kind of teasing, and you can tell that she doesn't know what she wants to do either, right? She's not committed now to breaking her vows, but she wants to break her vows, and she's looking for an excuse to break those vows. She's asking Anna basically to tell her it's okay to dive headfirst into this disastrous love affair. "Oh, Anna, sister, what night terrors grip me now? Who is this newcomer, this guest within our halls? And what a face he's got! What arms! What strong pectorals!" I love that she is just totally gaga over his gains. She's like into his big muscles. This is a really recognizable human speech, and it's meant to be, I think, sort of tragicomic. There's a certain degree of pitiableness in the way that Dido is coming apart at the seams here. The great queen undone by love. Who is this newcomer, this guest within our halls? And what a face he's got, what arms, what strong pectorals. I believe it too, and not from idle faith, when they say he's descended from the stock of gods. Of course he must be have divine descent. It's fear that gives degraded souls away. In other words, Aeneas has just been through this long story of his trials and travels and travails, and he bore up so bravely. So he was so manly when he bore up under those trials. Poor dear, fate-tossed, and those protracted wars he sang about. If it were not determined, settled in my soul, to never yoke myself in marriage bonds again, once death deceived me and my first love fell from me, if I were not disgusted by all marriage rites, I could surrender to this one mistake. Perhaps. So, obviously, she's acting as if this whole speech was just like a display of Aeneas' best virtues, and it probably was, because remember, the gods are sort of conspiring, or Venus at least is conspiring, to make this true. He's showing how manful and brave he is, and she's seeing him in this rosy glow. I mean, he actually didn't bear up all that well under the trials. Remember that when we met him, he was in total disarray, and that's the interesting part of his character. But she's just seeing him through these rose-tinted glasses. She's got total infatuation brain. That he's jacked, he's handsome, he's also fate-tossed, he's tragic. And I can save him if it were not determined. And then she goes on to this new thing, right? If it were not determined, settled in my soul to never yoke myself in marriage bonds again, if I hadn't promised, it's really a shame that I did promise. But if I hadn't promised, I would totally go for this one mistake. Huic uni forsan potui succumbere culpae. I could surrender to this one mistake. For Anna, I confess, since Sychaeus' sad fate, when our home's shrines were spattered with fraternal gore, this man alone has stirred my senses, loosened up my soul. In other words, that my grief is thawing. I recognize the marks of an old flame. But I would sooner earth should gape and swallow me, or the Almighty Father drive me to the shadowlands of Erebus, the depths of night, consigning me by thunderstrike to those grey depths, before, O chastity, I violate your laws or cancel them. So she's being sincere here. I genuinely believe that we're supposed to see this inner conflict and believe her. At the same time, she's being extremely melodramatic, and she's obviously asking for permission, right? These extremes, right? I recognize the marks of an old flame. That's a famous line. Ad nosco veteris vestigia flammae. I recognize the marks of an old flame, but I would sooner earth should gape and swallow me. This is tragic language. This is let the earth open up beneath me and swallow me down. Or the Almighty Father drive me to the shadowlands of Erebus. There's this repetition of the word umbra. Fulmen ad umbras, palentis umbras Erebi noctem quae profundum. The shadowlands of Erebus, the depths of night, consigning me by thunderstrike to those grey depths before, oh, chastity, I violate your laws. So we're supposed to both see her as this melodramatic kind of actress and pity her as genuinely in turmoil about what to do. And haven't we all been there, right? You crush on somebody you know is bad for you. You maybe sort of said you wouldn't, and yet so tempting, so handsome, right? And also she's remembering the genuine pain of loss. You know, she's a wounded, grieving widow. The man who first secured my vows absconded with my love. Let him preserve it there, within his sepulchre and keep it safe from harm. Now she's convincing herself that Zacchaeus, her husband, should have her love forever, that she's committed still, even in death, to loving him. With all that said, she filled her lap with welling tears. So a Roman audience would have been inclined, I think, not to be all that sympathetic to an emotional woman. And that's why it's kind of amazing that Virgil does make her very sympathetic and shows you that she is a high and elevated personage with ideals. We've already seen that she's basically an impressive woman with a lot of self-control. And now she's at the mercy of the gods. And we will discover down the line in subsequent episodes that Aeneas is also at their mercy in a different sort of way. But here we're seeing the kind of unmaking of a heroine, and Virgil needs to really sell this because he has to show what a challenge it is, how big a foe Carthage has been for Rome, and also, of course, how serious a foe Cleopatra was, and then also has to reduce her to a sobbing, gibbering mess. So he does it basically by bringing the tragic mode in and turning Dido into this tragic heroine. So there's elevations, obviously high art. Tragedy is one of the great modes of high art. It's also ultimately going to turn her into like the worst caricature of an emotional woman. And Anna, this is so precise the way Virgil does this. Anna basically convinces her to do it. And she does it, I would say, through another kind of perversion of the feminine. All of the beautiful things about being a woman, femininity, also have these distinctive kind of twisted, vicious versions. And one beautiful thing about femininity in this traditional mode is compassion, right? And charity. And so what you might call toxic empathy is when that gets kind of twisted in service of something bad, something that you shouldn't do, something that will be destructive. And so empathy is a good thing. Charity is a good thing. Loving, nurturing kindness is a good thing for men and women. Women can often be particularly, I think, good at it. But also, it can be directed in service of something bad, and you can tug on people's heartstrings to the point that charity becomes a kind of vice, or it becomes distorted into the vicious version of itself. And that's what happens here with Anna. She begins with this beautiful expression of love that I have always loved. O luce magis delecta sorore. Anna replied, O sister dearer than the daylight, will you grieve your livelong youth away alone? She's basically saying, this is too hard, it's too harsh to just mourn Zacchaeus forever. Will you grieve your lifelong youth away alone and never know the sweetness of a son and never win the rich rewards of Venus once again? You think that ghosts or ash within the tomb will care? Let be! No suitor has yet swayed your heartsick mind from Libya or Tyre. You look down on Iarbas and the other chieftains fattened on the wealth of Africa. These are other suitors that Dido has had. He said, you turned them away. But will you fight the love you like? Placitonetiam pugnabis amori. Will you fight with love that you actually enjoy? And has it ever crossed your mind to think about the neighbors next to whom you've set your citadel? In other words, you are surrounded by hostile enemies. You need a man to protect you, or at least you need a co-regent. You need a fellow ruler. So it's really piteous and tragic because these are good arguments made for good reasons, right? Anna is saying, look, I love you. I want you to be happy. You need children, right? You need a family. You need companionship. Why are you going to like waste your life away in mourning? And the only answer to that is, well, because of my duty, because of the vow I took, because of my obligations. And so here we are having a genuine clash between individual satisfaction or desire in the moment and duty. And the thing that this poem exists above all other things, I think, to install is this idea that sometimes in service of great endeavors, you have to shelve your personal desires and motivations. And so this is the setup. This is the situation in which Dido finds herself when the book opens. And we know from the beginning, because of the plotting and the scheming that's been going on, and because we sort of know the story probably before we embark on this poem, we know that this is a terrible mistake. But the genius of Virgil is to show you that the terrible mistake is not like foolhardy, self-destructive. I mean, it is all of those things, but it's also completely relatable and understandable, and it comes out of good intentions, just subtly distorted and clouded by passion. Because this is what desire really does to you, right? This is a more realistic version. It's not like people throw themselves off of cliffs for no reason. Sometimes from the outside, you can look and watch somebody, cheating on his wife, and you're like, how would he ever do that? And it obviously is a grave sin, right? That somebody just destroyed his life for like one good night, right? That he just wanted this thing so badly. And you're like, how could that happen? And then you kind of see it from your own perspective. It's like when you feel consumed by lust, right? You can suddenly start rationalizing to yourself. You can disguise your own motivations from yourself. You get clouded. So this is like it's kind of a male and female thing. I think that when people are infatuated, they start to argue to themselves about why they should have what they want when they know it's kind of bad for all sorts of reasons. But this in particular is a very female. It's as my friend Erica Bakioki might say, it's mediated through the female body. In other words, it is a universal, a human set of universals, virtues and vices in competition with one another. But it's recognizably womanly, this sisterly bond and relationship. And Virgil is kind of showing that spiraling off kilter, and the emotions taking the lead over the reason, and all of it not because Dido is evil or because she decided she woke up one day and she decided she was just going to be a crazy person, but because she's being driven mad by divine interference, by a hostile divine takeover. And it's important that this is done in the mode of tragedy, because tragedy is the great art form of showing how good, noble people can be caught in a trap of their own flaws, that the little chink in the armor of a good man can, or in this case woman, can bring him or her down. And these particular failings, because we live in this universe of chaos and disaster, and because we live this tragic life, you can be basically unmade by one flaw, which is sometimes represented as the vengeance of the gods. And here, to me, Dido represents or resembles nobody quite so much as Phaedra, a famous heroine from an earlier tragedy by Euripides. It's called the Hippolytus. Fun fact, I was in the Hippolytus in grad school. I played Hippolytus in a Greek language version of this presentation of the original Greek. And this is one of Euripides' best-known plays. It ends with the dismemberment of Hippolytus by chariot. It's a gruesome destruction. But the kind of core scene that we really remember is Euripides is famous for his heroine, so he's a good person to kind of turn to for inspiration. And Virgil turns here for inspiration to a tragic heroine, to Phaedra, who is Hippolytus' stepmother. And what's happened is that Hippolytus has sworn chastity, and Aphrodite, that is Venus, so the same goddess, has taken her revenge. And one way that that's happened is that Phaedra has become infected with love for her stepson. And this is obviously, it's haram. It's completely disgusting to a Greek mind. It's incestuous. It has this kind of taboo quality to it. And there's a remarkable exchange in the Hippolytus where Phaedra is sort of doing exactly the same thing that Dido is doing. She's saying that she doesn't want to talk about it. She doesn't want to reveal her desire, her shameful desire for Hippolytus. But she's sort of hinting at it until finally her nurse, that is her kind of caretaker, her trusted, intimate female sort of servant, essentially, says, come on, out with it, tell me, confide in me. And so much like Anna, the nurse kind of gets this confession out of her. And then another thing that Euripides is famed for is toying with sophistry. That is the kind of clever speeches that were very popular in Athens he tends to put into the mouths of his characters. And the nurse, much like Anna, gives this very persuasive reason why Phaedra shouldn't feel all that bad for being in love with Hippolytus. She says, "Mistress, the trouble you told me just now, coming on so suddenly, it did frighten me, but now I realize that I was foolish. In this world, second thoughts, it seems, are best. Your case is not so extraordinary, beyond thought or reason. The goddess in her anger has smitten you, and you are in love. What wonder is this? There are many thousands suffer with you. So, will you die for love? And all the others who love and who will love, must they die too?" Oh, Phaedra, clearly from the speech, right, remember, has basically threatened to take her own life over this. How will that profit? The tide of Cypris, that is of Aphrodite, is at its full surge, notwithstandable. Upon the yielding spirit she comes gently, but she finds one arrogant and superior, and she seizes him and abuses him completely. So this is the theme of the play, right? Because Hippolytus is also resisting desire by remaining celibate. He's sort of disgusted. He's got this kind of weird hang-up that Euripides puts on stage. He's disgusted by women, and now Aphrodite has taken her revenge. This is all very Greek. It's too Greek for Virgil, I would suspect. I think that Virgil, if he had created this kind of situation, this twisted psychosexual situation, and put it raw, unedited into his Augustan poem. Remember that Augustus was very concerned with sexual ethics and with chastity and moral probity. So this would have completely shocked his audience if he had done something like this. But he's definitely borrowing from it. All the elements are there. The vengeance of Aphrodite, that is Venus, is there. The kind of coy, teasing exchange between a woman and her closest female confidant, between this queenly Dido and her sort of maidenly-ish sister Anna, who's playing the role of the nurse here, and then this temptation, this sort of sophistical reasoning around to justifying the thing that you know you shouldn't do. And it's much less bad in the case. I mean, Phaedra's contemplating basically either a sort of incest or suicide. Dido is contemplating a relationship that technically is fine, but there are some extenuating circumstances, like her vow to Sychaeus, and of course the destiny that Aeneas has. And so her flaw, her evil, is much less horrifying, and therefore the justification of it or the reasoning around it is also much less scandalous. But this is in the background, and the idea of tragedy is in the background, so that we will both feel the horror of what is to come, and there is a suicide to come, so that also is an element that is borrowed from Euripides and from the Hippolytus, but we also see Dido as this tragic heroine, and so we understand her not as somebody who's just uniquely vicious, but actually somebody who is elevated, and so therefore her fall is all the more heartbreaking and horrifying, and it causes us to think about the ways that we might be toyed with by love, that we might become victims of love's vindictive games. But the other thing, of course, here is that Aphrodite in Euripides is just a no-holds-barred kind of savage. She comes in, she is the classic, this again is very Greek, this classic undeniable force, and if you try to suppress her, she will destroy you. All of that power is there, has to be there for Virgil, because again, Aphrodite, Venus, is related to Augustus, but for that exact same reason, she sort of can't be the absolutely ruthless, heartless, almost amoral force that she is in a lot of the Greek myths. She has to be a little bit more decorous than that. And so now the next thing that Virgil does is he changes the scene to remind us that this is not just only Dido's fault, but also part of a divine plot, and he changes his sources of inspiration. So in Dido world, we've got tragedy. We've got the sort of Greek tragedy inspiring the very delicate and sad kind of breakdown of Queen Dido. Now, in God world, we're back to epic. We switch to the divine, elevated kind of world of the blessed gods, and we have what's called a type scene, a scene that we get in epic all the time, that comes back again and again. And in this case, it's the conspiratorial plot between two goddesses, which is why this is really the Mean Girls episode. Because now, if we've seen sort of weaponized or toxic compassion. Now we see another thing that often, I think, comes up when specifically female relationships break down, and that is subterfuge, right? That is underhanded and kind of insincere displays of flattery that actually have poison barbs underneath them. And I think you'll see a lot of this when people talk about, like, what are the toxic behaviors that women engage in. And don't worry, by the way, we're going to get to the kind of breakdown of masculinity and the failures of manhood in a subsequent episode. This is the Mean Girls episode, right? But they are both here, and this is something that people talk about a lot. In like women-dominated workforces, for instance, that there's the kind of like indirect mode of criticism and like undermining somebody while pretending to be their friend, fake friendship, insincerity, right? All of that is very much here in what Virgil does with the epic tradition, all the while maintaining the upper hand for Venus, which is, again, an innovation and something very clever that he does to flatter Augustus while still giving us juicy gossip and hot tea. So, to set the scene here, what we're going to have eventually is a feigned collaboration between Venus and Juno, who are enemies, remember, right? They are dead set against one another because Juno loves Carthage and she loves Dido, and she sees that her whole world is about to be shattered by this upstart Aeneas. And Venus loves Aeneas because she's his mama, right? She's taking care of him, she's invested in him, and she's especially invested in his glory, in his destiny. That's what she cares most about. She wants to make sure that this prophecy of his grand adventure is fulfilled and that Rome becomes great. And that can't happen if Aeneas just becomes a kind of first gentleman of Carthage, right? If he gets domesticated as the lapdog of Dido or whatever. So she's conspiring by infecting Dido with this wild passion. She's conspiring to destroy Dido and get Aeneas free of the grips of the queen. Juno wants to salvage something from this whole thing, and so she wants to turn this love affair to her advantage by making it into a real union, by forcing this wild passion into something like marriage. And so she comes to Venus, she comes to the goddess of love, and she basically proposes a truce. It's a truce, though, with a certain underhanded motive, because ultimately Juno wants to get her way by using this love to keep Aeneas there. Venus pulls a very Mean Girls move, and she agrees, knowing that what will actually happen is Dido will be destroyed, because she's already sowed the seeds of that. And so this is an extremely canny act by Venus, and it is an extremely canny subversion by Virgil of the usual order of events here, because this scene where Juno and Venus get together and they conspire, this has a long, long history. In fact, it goes right back to our earliest Greek epic, the Iliad, in which Juno is the one who takes the initiative and asks for Aphrodite's help. And there, Aphrodite is basically the handmaid. Juno, of course, that is Hera in the Greek version. Hera is queen of the gods. She should obviously be in charge. She should obviously get her way. And one way that she does that is occasionally by seducing Zeus and lulling him to sleep after sex. And Homer gives us this great scene where she basically summons the other lesser goddesses like Athena and Aphrodite to help her. And Aphrodite comes when she's called. When she calls Aphrodite, she comes away. She calls her away from the other gods, aponeuthe alone theon, and talked to her and says, "Will you please, O delightful child, tekos hotiken eipo, will you pithoio, will you be persuaded by whatever I ask you, and not deny me anything that I request," right? And so this is kind of a courtly and decorous scene. This is the queen among her handmaidens. Obviously, Aphrodite's not going to say no, but she's being asked nicely, right? Will you fulfill my request? Wilt thou? I mean, it's almost like a French medieval court, right? There's deference, there's decorum. It's like a kind of sport almost, a high, decorous sport. There's still plenty of chicanery among the gods. We learn later on from the Odyssey that Aphrodite is kind of a figure of mockery and fun. She's an adulteress. She can be tricksy, even in Homer, but she definitely is going to do what Juno asks. She calls Hera presba, that is to say eldest or elder god, presbythea, thugater megaloio chronoio. So there's a reminder here, right, that Aphrodite is the thugater dios. She's the daughter of Zeus. But Hera is the daughter of Kronos. So there's a hierarchy, there's a pecking order, and it comes from a natural line of descent that Kronos, who is Zeus's father, is also Hera's father. So she's the presbythea. She's in charge here, right? And she says, I'll do whatever you want. Anything that can be done, I will do, right? So this is a reminder of who's in charge of the hierarchy, the right order of things. And that's kind of the background of this conspiracy that's about to happen in Book 4 of the Aeneid, that usually in these sorts of scenes, the audience would expect to see Aphrodite kind of hop to it. And even in later epics, that still is kind of the case, but it does start to curdle and sour as you get away from the classical, archaic epics and into some of the more ironic and playful epics of what's called the Hellenistic period. So this epic tradition has been stretching on for a long, long time before Virgil. Homer kind of begins it along with Hesiod, and then in the Alexandrian era, that is the Hellenistic period after the death of Alexander, when the Library of Alexander becomes this cultural center, you get almost like a kind of postmodern movement that plays around with these sorts of tropes and scenes. And there we have another version of this Aphrodite, Hera, Juno, Venus scene, and that's from Apollonius of Rhodes, who composed an epic called the Argonautica. We have large portions of it. We don't have the whole thing. But we do have this scene. They're conspiring to, not to seduce Zeus, but to infect Medea with unruly love. And so this is even closer now. We're getting closer to Virgil's themes because Medea is another model for Dido. And we'll talk more about that in a later episode. But basically, in addition to the tragic heroine Phaedra, we also have the tragic heroine Medea, who was put on stage by Euripides. So Euripides is very much here. Homer is very much here. But Apollonius is also here with this scene that toys and plays with the old Homeric scene where you're in the court and the lovely goddess calls to her daughter, thugater chronoio, to the daughter of Kronos, and then the daughter of Zeus is kind of serving her willingly, right? Now we get this same kind of scene in Apollonius, but it's full of little unspoken, even kind of mysterious barbs. There's all sorts of subterranean hostilities brewing here. In the version that Apollonius gives us, we first have a conspiracy between Hera and Athena, and they are now on a kind of higher rung of godhood, and they come together to ask Aphrodite for her help in infatuating Medea with Jason. Aphrodite here is in some ways an even more abject, servile figure. She can't even get her son to obey her. She's really weak in Apollonius, and she has to beg with Eros, with Cupid, to go and do her bidding. But on the other hand, she has this sort of underhanded smile. And this is a classic thing. Aphrodite's often represented smiling. She's smiling Aphrodite. And it's a very ambiguous smile because on the one hand, of course, love is lovely. And when love smiles on you, you smile back and all of that. But also, there's something sinister about it. And when they come in, when Athena and Hera come in to ask for help from Aphrodite, she's kind of slyly smiling, and they ask her for their help, and then upon their command, when they enter in full state and they demand her help, she does snap to attention, and she's almost struck dumb, and she ends up saying, "Potnathea, O queenly goddess, may I be counted as nothing if I don't obey you." So she does give this very almost groveling response, but she does it in a way that seems to kind of undermine the queenly nature of Hera that we have in Homer. And this is what Virgil seizes on, and he grasps it. And by the time we get to Virgil, this relationship is completely flipped on its end. And in Virgil, the surrender of Aphrodite, of Venus, is itself her greatest victory. So what happens is, remember, Juno comes and says, let's work together. Let's call a truce. Let's sort of get these two lovers together. And Aphrodite, sensit simulata mente locutam. She sensed, she perceived that Juno was speaking with a feigned intention, that she's being deceptive. And she dolus risit repertis. She laughed, her famous Cytherean, her famous Venus laugh, having found out Juno's scheme. So these are two kind of backbiting, underhanded schemers, and one is getting the best on the other by doing a better impression of obliging and complying. So the only difference between the two of them here is that Venus is serving fate, and Juno is trying to fight against fate. And that's why I say that that's the salient moral fact here. Because otherwise, these two goddesses are both being completely catty and underhanded mean girls. But Virgil wants us to see that and to dramatize that and to kind of play with the epic tradition, all while he still gives Venus the upper hand. And he does it by keeping her this sort of subservient figure, but by showing how her subservience is a kind of victory. It's soft power winning out over hard power, and that preserves Venus as the queen that we want her to be, because we need her to be Augustus' lord. So this is like not only great poetry, it's also great politicking. It's incredible maneuvering to preserve this artistic freedom, to do all sorts of kind of underhanded and interesting things with the art, while you also elevate Venus to this position that she's never had before of incredible power. And that is where the situation rests as we turn, which we will do next time, to the outpouring of desire and passion that ultimately brings Aeneas and Dido into connubial bliss. They are going to act on their desires. They're going to sleep together. And it's all going to get incredibly weird next time. So look forward to that as the mean girl Venus gets her way. Okay, this is such a great book. This is like a really, really fun part of the Aeneid. So I'm very glad that you are here with me exploring it. I like to do a few things at the end of every episode, the first of which is It Figures. So Virgil, in addition to being a very sly craftsman and politicker, he's also a fascinating stylist. And it can be really, really fun to sort of observe what he's doing with language, especially when, you can have the fun of going back into the Latin and talking about problems of translation. So every time I finish an episode, I like to do a little segment on figures of speech, because these are genuinely useful. They're ways of basically understanding and categorizing rhetoric, the way that people use language to kind of persuade and to allure and beguile. And Virgil is obviously full of it. And here we have all these speeches. So the figure of speech that I want to tell you about today is called synecdoche, not to be confused with Schenectady, New York. It comes from two Greek words, syn, which means with or together, and ekdoche, which means a kind of understanding or a reception, when you receive an idea. That's ekdoche. So synecdoche is when two ideas get understood together. And what are those two ideas? Well, specifically, it is when you use a part of something to stand in for the whole thing, or vice versa, if you use the whole thing to stand in for a part of something. So a really easy example of synecdoche that we use all the time, every day in life, is when you say something like, New York won the ball game last night. And what you really mean is the Mets won the game against the Dodgers or whatever, right? But you use the whole thing, the city, to stand in for this one subsection of the thing. If you say HR wants to speak with you, you probably mean like Carol, right? You probably mean one person who wants to talk to you, but Carol is representing here the whole of HR. And so you can use HR in turn to represent her. So either way that relationship goes, synecdoche is the figure of speech that kind of allows you to play with this. Why would you do this? Why might this work? Well, think about the HR example again, right? If you just say Carol wants to speak with you, well, Carol might want to talk with you about any number of things, right? She's a multifaceted person who exists in many different capacities. Maybe she's just like asking if you want to go to lunch. But if HR wants to speak with you, that's Carol in her capacity as representative of an entire power structure. And you probably feel very, very differently about hearing HR wants to speak with you than you do about hearing Carol wants to speak with you. So synecdoche is a way of emphasizing or drawing out that aspect of the situation that makes the impact most emotionally true or powerful. So an example of using the part for the whole rather than the whole for the part would be, yeah, I got to go and kiss the ring, right? Now, you may not actually be kissing a literal ring, but even if you are, the ring kissing is not actually the point, right? The ring stands in for this enormous power that you have to please or flatter. If you're kissing the ring, you're going to the Oval Office, let's say, and you're buttering Trump up and you're telling him how great he is so that you can get this or that, so that you can be in his good graces. And even if you had a little ring, right, the point of that would be this small thing that stands in for this enormous thing, right? And the ring is like concentrated and powerful. And so that phrase is a form of synecdoche that drives home the kingly nature of what you're trying to convey. So there's one example of this in here that is really interesting because it actually helps to show how difficult translation can be. And it's a classic Latin synecdoche. And that is when Dido says, as I've translated, if I were not disgusted by all marriage rites. What she actually says is, si non per taesum thalami tie-dieque fuisit. The thalamus and the tie-dye are the wedding torches and the wedding bed. And this is the very particular and exact description of the parts of marriage that are now have become repulsive to Dido. The torches and the bed are associated with this big kind of Roman ceremony all around the first sex that a couple has on their wedding night. And it's got Greek antecedents, and it was taken up in Rome. And it was a carnival, and so the things that she's reacting to here are the kind of excesses and the fleshly nature of marriage. It's very difficult to say wedding torches in English and have it get the same impact. You might do something like all wedding beds, all marriage beds. If I were not disgusted by all wedding beds might also be a translation here that would work. But something that gives you a particular item that's conveying what Dido is saying, which is that she's kind of been sexually shut down, right? That she's gotten locked down after her grief, and she's disgusted not just by marriage, the institution, but by the part of marriage that is a kind of wild and crazy bacchanal of letting loose, channeling sexual energies into the right place, right? That's what the marriage ceremony is kind of about, and that's the point of mentioning via synecdoche the thalamos and the tie-dye, the torches and the wedding bed. So it can be an extremely potent, but also a very culturally specific kind of thing. So now that I'm looking at it, I actually think I would say if I were not disgusted by all wedding beds here, rather than marriage rites, although both are kind of fair translations of what's going on. So that's it, figures, and now I am excited to take a mailbag question. So mailbag questions come to me on rejoiceevermore.substack.com. I really think that if you like this show, you will be interested in my Substack. It's been growing steadily, and I really love writing for it. It's just kind of a way for me to communicate directly with you any thoughts that I'm having during the week. And there's extra stuff for those that become paid supporters, which I greatly, greatly appreciate. It really helps me to do what I do and not to put too many ads on this show and all of that. So please do, if you haven't already, go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com and become a subscriber. And that is also the way that you can write to me. You can DM me there, or you can reply to one of my Friday essays, and I will file your question away. I try to answer as many of them as possible. Can't answer them all, and I take a while to get around to them. So if your question hasn't been answered yet, don't lose hope. Keep listening, and hopefully I will eventually. But I wanted this time around to answer this lovely question from Meg. And it's particularly relevant to what we're talking about here because it's about morality in art. And we've already seen how Virgil takes care of the moral sensibilities of his Roman audience when he's presenting them this scandalous Greek material. So here's what Meg says. Hi, Spencer. I was wondering what you think about updating the Odyssey to reflect Judeo-Christian morals and values. We get upset when progressives appropriate stories to further their agenda, but my sisters are into this musical retelling of the Odyssey. Epic. We've talked about this on the show. I really like Epic. I think it's great. But I think, says Meg, that it actually makes improvements to the story. The musical changes it so Odysseus is faithful to his wife, which makes him more likable and heroic to modern audiences. One could argue that this erases the historical perspectives of the ancient Greek value system, but we have the original Odyssey to capture that. I was wondering what you think about taking liberties to create new versions of this classic. Thank you, and I hope you have a great Easter. Oh, thank you so much. It is still Easter, by the way. So we have, I think, 8 weeks of Easter, just like we have 40 days of Lent. And so thank you for your Easter wishes. And I find this question really, really fascinating because, as Meg, you indicate, there's been a big controversy lately over editing things and changing things to suit our modern morals. And when the most high-profile version of this is when we have these kind of liberal or progressive critiques of the ancient world. Oh, they're not nice enough to women. Oh, they're not, there are slaves. There are all these bad things. So should we even be reading this at all? And if we read it, should we kind of try to subvert or change this morality? And I think a lot of what we talked about today, it's funny, in the ancient world, the sex would have been the stuff that was most offensive or dangerous to talk about, I think. In the modern world, it's the suggestion of female irrationality, right? Which I hope I got across quite clearly, that I don't think what Virgil is saying is women are always irrational, but rather that irrational behavior is one consequence of a thing that often happens among women when their virtues become degraded, right? And so all of that, and talking about it in a specifically, as it were, gendered context, would be extremely offensive to the modern progressive. And I bet if they made the Aeneid as a movie, they would probably turn Dido into some sort of girl boss. And there've been all sorts of versions of this, in fact. And you got it actually with Penelope in the movie The Return. If you saw that movie with Ralph Fiennes, there was a real change made to Penelope's character so that she wouldn't just be the kind of faithful wife, but rather she would have this grim critique of war and all of that. And so she was updated to be made more kind of tasteful to modern sensibilities. So I find that just very tedious because I think it's not a particularly compelling vision of the moral universe. But what Meg's question draws out is we all do this to some extent when we come to ancient texts or even text, any book or movie or anything that's from a time that's different from our own, a culture, a place, a time that's different from our own. We all find things that we don't agree with morally. Of course we do. I mean, that's actually the point of reading great literature, in some sense, is to expand your mind. You don't have to accept everything that you're shown, but you have to understand the part of the world where this is done differently, right? And so I would begin by saying that it definitely is essential to resist this impulse with the original material. And it's essential to buck up as adults and face up to the original material and grapple with it and not just say, oh, we love our great classical authors, but refuse to accept the ways in which their sexual morality was different from ours or their ethics were different from ours, right? We have to kind of face that head on, and I would never, ever support changing the text itself or changing or concealing it or taking it off of a syllabus for that reason. Once you get to adaptations, the minute you get to things like The Return or, taking something from the ancient world and bringing it into the modern world, you're in a completely different ballgame, right? So the first thing where you change the original text or you censor it, you shut it down, that's called bawdlerism or bawdlerization. And it's called that because Thomas Bowdler, Bowdler, put out an edition. He was a physician who was famous for putting out an edition of Shakespeare where he cut everything out. And if you look at the title page, it's called it says 10 volumes in which nothing is added to the original text, but those words and expressions are omitted, which cannot with propriety be read aloud in a family. And this has been much mocked, but it's basically a family edition of Shakespeare. And bawdlerization is typically thought of as a terrible thing. And I would say that it is a kind of crude, and it's a kind of a Philistine impulse, and it goes up my spine when people do that. But it doesn't go up my spine, for instance, when somebody says, here's a children's Bible, right? Here's the Bible that teaches you the stories in these basic ways. We don't necessarily need to talk about exactly what David was doing with, Bathsheba, right? We don't have to be like so explicit, but we do eventually have to have in mind that we're training kids up to be ready to receive the stuff that is more adult material. So you adapt something for a specific audience, for a specific time. That seems perfectly fine and normal to me. And then I would go one step further and I would say sometimes it actually can be helpful to translate things into a new cultural context. Again, never representing this as the actual original. But if you were to say, take a morally neutral example. You say like, okay, in the ancient world, they wore a toga. But a toga just looks to us like a funny bedsheet now. So let's translate that into a royal garment. Let's translate that into like, or a senatorial, like a kingly garment. Let's have a guy wearing a suit, or let's paint a guy wearing a kind of courtly Renaissance costume. The Renaissance painters did this all the time. They took Bible figures, they took people from the classical text, and they would redesign them in a way that got the same impact across, kind of visual translation. I'm not totally against doing that at a moral level either, and I think that's kind of what the composer of Epic is doing when he doesn't give you Odysseus' infidelities. He's sort of saying, if I interpret him correctly, it's like, yes, Odysseus in the story sleeps with other women on his way back home. He gets with Calypso and Circe and all that, but the moral equivalent to that will help us to regard it in the right way now is if we imagine him as faithful the whole time, as never having slept with anybody else. In other words, the Greeks would have regarded Odysseus occasionally having dalliances with other women, then getting home to Penelope and leaving and going and forcing his way back home. That would have been morally equivalent to him staying faithful the whole time. I talked about this a lot when we talked about the Odyssey, that's basically not a kind of infidelity in Greek eyes. And so translating it into a version of heroism that doesn't include infidelity in the modern view makes a certain moral logic that actually kind of stays faithful to the story in a weird sort of way. This is all a matter of taste, and we're walking on very, very shaky ground here, because the other thing is, of course, in order to make changes that are morally reflective of the original, you have to have a kind of virtuous moral outlook, and you have to have a coherent moral outlook, and that is something that you simply have to argue for, right? One reason we don't like progressive edits of ancient texts, but we do like modern edits of ancient texts that sort of move in a more moral direction, is because we think progressive morality is bad morality. It's not about the moral edit so much as the kind of morality that's being put on display. But ultimately, I think, a couple things are true. Everybody is always doing this to something. Virgil is doing it, right? When Virgil takes these stories, these Greek stories, and he reworks them into a kind of Roman setting, and he changes it so that Phaedra is not as, or Dido is sort of less horrifying to Roman sensibilities than Phaedra would be. He's doing exactly this same thing in adaptation form. Now, he's doing it with different characters, so there's something, I think, to be said for that. But then he does take Venus and change the moral status of Venus, right, from the moral status of Aphrodite in Homer. That this kind of revisionism is part of art, and it's part of how we grapple and wrestle with art. At the same time, the thing itself, right, the original text, once it's out there, becomes a really important way for us to break ourselves out of our moral certainties. And so I'm deeply against editing or Baudelarizing or changing the text itself. They used to do this with Catullus, by the way, in schools. Up until very recently, Catullus was a very saucy and sexy Roman poet. They would take out all the bad poems, or they would write the bad words in Latin so that nobody could understand them, and then translate everything else into English. Or they'd do all sorts of stuff like this. And that's just you're not getting Catullus. And whatever value there is in expanding your mind into thinking about other parts of the world when you are ready and at an appropriate age, right? that value is lost if you try to silence the original author. But once the original author is out there, if you want to play around with them and if you want to adapt him and, try to translate his moral universe into yours, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just that your morality has to be good, and you got to do it with a fair amount of humility to understand that the moral differences between you and the artist aren't all in one direction. It's not just because you're so much more virtuous than the artist that you get to do this. It's because your morality is different than the artist, that it's valuable to compare the two, to try to translate between one and the other while keeping your eye firmly on the reality of the original text and not trying to wish it away or scrub it out. That was a really juicy question, Meg. Thank you. And if you have further questions, if others have further questions, go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com to become a subscriber. If you're not already a subscriber to this podcast, we will continue on through book 4 as the weeks go on and through the rest of the Aeneid in our series. So hit subscribe, hit like, hit share. All of that really helps me. It helps me to continue doing this. And I love doing this with you. I hope you do too. So don't forget to rate 5 stars and spread things around. I hear that Spotify is going to be doing some things with their stats. So maybe sign up on Spotify if you haven't already. But wherever you get your podcast would be great. Check out my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, at Amazon or wherever you get your books. And come back next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.